Welcome to Kentucky Writers Day 2021. I'm Chris Cathers, Director of the Kentucky Arts Council. No matter what corner of the Commonwealth you're joining us from today, or even if you're joining us from outside of Kentucky, we invite you to celebrate the rich literary tradition our state has to offer, from Jessie Stewart all the way up to our new Poet Laureate, whom you'll be meeting a little later in the program. In recent months, we have been offering a land acknowledgement as part of any of our public gatherings, and we'll be doing so today as well. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. Today, we stand on ground occupied by ancient peoples whose history has been lost, but whose legacy remains. The evidence of these ancient people can be seen all over Kentucky through the mounds and artifacts left behind. Today, over 170 American Indian tribes are represented by their members living and working in the Commonwealth. Let us honor those who were here and those who are here now and build on the legacy of stewardship of the land they left for us into the seventh generation. To kick off Writers' Day, we've asked Mike Berry, Secretary of the Tourism, Arts, and Heritage Cabinet, to talk about the history of Kentucky Writers' Day. The Kentucky Arts Council is grateful for the support of the Tourism, Arts, and Heritage Cabinet. We are one of 13 agencies within the Cabinet, all working to tell Kentucky's story in our own unique ways. It is my pleasure now to introduce Secretary Mike Berry.
Today we come together to celebrate Kentucky Writers' Day, a day when we honor the Commonwealth's strong literary tradition and celebrate the anniversary of the birth of Robert Penn Warren. Born April 24, 1905 in Todd County, Kentucky, Warren was a Rhodes Scholar who received the Pulitzer Prize for All the King's Men and 2 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. Warren was named the first U.S. Poet Laureate consultant for poetry in 1986, a role he held until his death in 1989. Here in Kentucky, the position of Poet Laureate was established in 1926. James T. Cotton Noe was the first writer to serve the Commonwealth in this capacity. At that time, Poet Laureates were appointed to lifetime terms, and at times several poets held the position simultaneously. In an effort to honor the lifetime achievements of Robert Penn Warren, the General Assembly established Kentucky Writers' Day in 1990. This bipartisan commitment to Kentucky's literary culture enacted new legislation that would allow the governor to appoint the Commonwealth's Poet Laureate for a 2-year term. The word poet in the title is designed to represent writers whose accomplishments are in any literary form and pay tribute to culture and heritage that make Kentucky so unique. Since 1926, Kentucky has remained committed to continuing our tradition of honoring Robert Penn Warren and writers who represent every part of our Commonwealth. This year, I want to thank you for joining us as we celebrate Writers' Day and the induction of our new Poet Laureate. Today, we honor Kentucky's prestigious literary legacy tradition and celebrate all writers who continue to follow in the footsteps of Warren by placing Kentucky at the forefront in the literary community.
Thank you, Secretary Berry. On March 2nd, the Kentucky Arts Council hosted the state finals for the Poetry Out Loud National Recitation Competition. The virtual competition was presented in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts and the Poetry Foundation, and is part of a national program that encourages high school students to learn about great poetry through memorization, performance, and competition. Students from 12 Kentucky high schools competed. The winner of this year's Poetry Out Loud state final is Emma Robeson, representing Allen County Scottsville High School. Emma is a triplet and has an affinity for reading, solving murder mysteries, and writing poetry. As Kentucky State Champion, Emma will receive a $200 cash prize, and her school will receive a $500 stipend for the purchase of poetry materials. She will represent Kentucky at the virtual Poetry Out Loud National Finals in a few weeks, and will compete against students from all over the United States. The winner of the Poetry Out Loud National Recitation Contest will receive $20,000 in scholarship funds being awarded by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Poetry Foundation. The winner's school will also receive $500 for the purchase of poetry books. Please welcome Kentucky State Poetry Out Loud champion, Emma Robeson.
Immortal Sails by Alfred Noes. Now, in a breath, we'll burst those gates of gold and ransack heaven before our moment fails. Now, in a breath, before we too grow old, we'll mount and sing and spread immortal sails. It is not time that makes eternity. Love and an hour may quite outspan the years and give us more to hear and more to see than life can wash away with all its tears. Dear, when we part, at last, that sunset sky shall not be touched with deeper hues than this. But we shall ride the lightning ere we die and seize our brief infinitude of bliss, with time to spare for all that heaven can tell. While Isme dies, and look, their last farewell.
Thank you, Emma. We wish you the very best of luck in the National Poetry Out Loud Finals. We'll be watching the live stream and rooting for you. And now joining us in the celebration of Kentucky's literary excellence and to introduce the Kentucky Poet Laureate for 2021-2022, Governor Andy Beshear.
It's Writers' Day in Kentucky, and I am honored to introduce our newly appointed Kentucky Poet Laureate, Crystal Wilkinson. Crystal Wilkinson is a native of Casey County. Her appointment as Poet Laureate is especially significant because Crystal is the first black woman to hold this prestigious role ever in the Commonwealth. We are honored to introduce her as a part of today's Writers' Day, showing Kentuckians across the Commonwealth her moving work, exceptional talent, and love for her craft. Crystal is an award-winning author of 3 books, and her 4th book, Perfect Black, will be released in August from the University Press of Kentucky. Her work has been recognized with prestigious awards and recognitions, including the Kentucky Arts Council's Al Smith Individual Artist Fellowship. Her fiction, poems, and essays have also appeared in numerous journals and anthologies. Crystal is not only a writer, she's also an educator who's dedicated her life to shaping the brilliant minds of Kentuckians. She has shared her love and talent for writing with students at several Kentucky universities, 2 of which helped shape Crystal into the esteemed writer and dedicated educator she is today. Crystal is a proud alumni of Eastern Kentucky University and Spalding University, and has worked with students at both Morehead State and Berea College. Currently, Crystal serves as an associate professor of English at the University of Kentucky. So it is my great honor to introduce her as the 2021-2022 Kentucky Poet Laureate. Crystal, on behalf of Team Kentucky, we congratulate you on this incredible milestone in your career. And we thank you. We thank you for your commitment to education in Kentucky and for sharing your talents with all of us here in the Commonwealth. Congratulations.
Thank you to Tamara Coffey, Chris Cathers, Tom Musgrave, and all of the Kentucky Arts Council staff. I also want to thank Governor Andy Beshear and his cabinet for honoring the arts in the Bluegrass. Anyone watching this who knows me knows I cried when I was told of this news. Even as a writer, it is difficult to find words that convey the depth of my gratitude for this honor. When I looked at the long list of poet laureates, I realized very quickly that I know or have met 13 of these former laureates, everyone since 1995, beginning with James Still, who I revered so much that I stood in his line to get my book signed one year at the Kentucky Book Fair in Frankfort and was so excited that I couldn't go up to meet him. I just stood back, starstruck, saying, "There he is," but I didn't move. I've also met Richard Taylor, of course, visited his bookstore. I think I met Joe Servant in Bowling Green at the Southern Festival of Books. Among these 13 are mentors and teachers. Sina Naslin taught my first fiction class in graduate school at Spalding University, and I'm still learning from her tutelage in both fiction and in how best to lead a writer's life. James Baker Hall, along with Marianne, attended a Lexington Arts Council reading in the early years and stayed afterwards to introduce themselves to me and to encourage my work. At the time, I didn't know they were writers of great merit. I thought they were just kind people, and they were. Jim and I would have many great conversations over the years, and he is greatly missed. I took Gurney Norman's workshop at Hazard Community College's Spring Writers Conference years ago, and he became a mentor to me, to the Appalachian poets, to the world. Gurney is the Johnny Appleseed of Kentucky's literary landscape, planting seeds all across the state to grow Kentucky writers. Before the pandemic, we often found ourselves in a car headed to some writing event. Once, Gurney drove me through Perry County and recounted stories of his life and his people. Then in turn, I drove him to the Harriet Arnault Conference, and on our way back, I took a winding path through Casey County and told him the story of my home place and my people. I first met Frederick Smock through his work at the Kentucky Foundation for Women. I took a poetry class from Jeff Worley at the Carnegie Center, where I served as assistant director years ago. And from him, I learned about poetry, but also so much about teaching. I wrote one of my poems that appear in the new collection in his class. And the women. Oh, the women. Jane Gentry, Georgetta Lyon, Maureen Moorhead are all brilliant, all my word sisters. I've taught with Jane in workshops across the state, but also been inspired by her grace. She was the consummate poet, teacher, and a passionate advocate for Kentucky writers. Georgella and I talk writing, but I think the first conversations we had were about mothering when our boys were teenagers. They are men now. We've had tea and talked about what ought to be in this world, and I'm grateful. Maureen Moorhead and I taught together at Spalding University and have spent hours late in the evening talking about writing, talking about life, and laughing with our heads thrown back. And Frank X. Walker, here we are, Frank, again. Frank is family. We grew up 30 minutes apart, him in Boyle County and me in Casey County. Our first cousins are married to one another. He brought me into the fold of the Appalachian poets nearly 30 years ago. He is my brother in the word and in the world. And me, since becoming a published writer in 2000, so many of my speeches and talks have begun like this. Once upon a time, far up a holler, in the hills of Kentucky, there was a cinnamon-skinned daughter with hair as black as starling's wings. A writer is all she ever wanted to be. I'm going to retire that phrase after today, but it's true. All I ever wanted to be was a writer. And books began that journey. This journey began with me in my grandmother's arms being read to as a child. I was a child enamored with books and how they transported me out of our little house on Indian Creek to anywhere the story dared to take us. In every corner of our house were stacks of books. Books that were discarded by the school teachers my grandmother cleaned house for. Books that I ordered from the Weekly Reader. Comic books. So many, many books. Though I don't recall a book by even one Black author, until college. When I read, though, the more I read, the more I wanted to become a writer. I was 14 years old the first time I was published. The book was a romantic teenage story that I bound myself with my grandmother's Singer sewing machine. A book of 14 pages with one crooked seam along the red line that snaked down the left side of the blue lined paper. My block lettering was large and leaning, and I carefully placed on the cover, "My dream come true." There was only one hand-stitched, hand-lettered copy. My grandmother guarded this first work of mine. She watched me from behind the screen door, my body cradled in the overgrown roots of a tree, going about writing like killing snakes. Her call for me to come to supper fell on deaf ears. She found me down by the creek or out by the edge of the woods at dusk in a scribbling fury. She respected my shut doors and witnessed my silence while I worked on that first book. And although she died in 1994, I feel that she is still giving me permission and space to write. When my grandmother died, I found that book tucked safely away in a box of papers with my name on it. The book was nestled in its own folder among the bad rhyming poems and choppy fairy tales that made up my early writings. But they were always of Kentucky. I am someone who has walked hills and knobs, someone who was grandparent raised, someone who knows the value of sorghum and pinto beans and rhubarb pie and bread on the table, who knows outhouses and one-room churches, who knows a country woman's rituals, foodways, and celebrations. I write from the core of my own existence. My literary imagination will always live in Kentucky, and that is something I'm very proud of. As Poet Laureate, I hope to continue to build community across the state and to help increase awareness of the many voices that make up Kentucky's story. Through writing workshops, readings, and visits to libraries, schools, and non-traditional community spaces, I want to gather the stories of the bluegrass and hold them up for everyone to see. I also hope to start a podcast that amplifies elementary school writers, our elder writers, and emerging writers who are making a national impact like Joy Priest and Gwenda Bond, among so many others. There is more than one way to be a writer, so I want to not only highlight our traditional poets, but also other literary art forms, including Kentucky fiction writers, memoirists, and filmmakers. This shows just how diverse and divine our Commonwealth is. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I'll remember this year that I became Kentucky's Poet Laureate as a dire one. I'm talking to you via my home office instead of being in the Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort celebrating. More than 5,000 Kentuckians have died from COVID. This has been the year our democracy has bent and nearly crumbled. And we are still seeking justice for Breonna Taylor, who was killed in Louisville 1 year ago. But also, this is the month that I'm named Kentucky Poet Laureate. And we have seen the first signs of spring. And with spring, there is hope. Kentuckians are being vaccinated. Claudia Lovemayer, coordinator of the Kentucky Black Writers Collective at the Carnegie Center in Lexington, just held a beautiful memorial for Breonna Taylor featuring Kentucky writers, including Frank X. Walker, George Ella Lyon, Ronald Davis, Jude McPherson, Savannah Sipple, Silas House, Hannah Drake. Hannah Drake is in Louisville doing powerful work as an activist, teacher, and poet, exacting change, inspiring but also holding institutions and individuals accountable. Damaris Hill is putting the finishing touches on a new book about Black girlhood. Frank Walker is continuing to tour with Masked Man Black, poems about the pandemic and protest. Joy Priest just signed a contract to edit a collection of poems by Louisville's Black poets. Filmmaker Joan Brannon released a documentary, Fire and Heart, a blueprint for liberation during the pandemic, and it has been widely viewed. And Kentucky writer Gail Jones, who has been described as one of the great writers of the 20th century, her new novel, Palmares, will be released in September, followed by 5 new works to be published by her in the next 2 years. So we have so much to look forward to. I want to amplify the voices of all Kentucky writers. So if you are a Kentucky writer, tell me about your story or invite me to tell you about mine. Thank you all.
Thank you, Crystal, and we wish you success as you take on this important role as Kentucky's literary ambassador. If you want to learn more about Crystal and her mission as Poet Laureate, visit the link to our website below. There you can find a bio on Crystal, as well as a schedule of her activities as Poet Laureate. Our first reader, Richard Taylor, served as Kentucky Poet Laureate 1999 through 2000. He is a professor of English and Keenan Visiting Writer at Transylvania University and former Poet Laureate of Kentucky. Taylor has written over a dozen books, including Gertie, Earthbones, and Elkhorn, Evolution of a Kentucky Landscape, which was awarded the Thomas D. Clark Medallion.
Christmas morning. The unfamiliar window looks out on woods, dingy, furred, broken by little spits of light. The first motion I make out is an enormous buck, his rack floating in a corona of limbs. He moves with serenity and assurance, with the subtlety of water soaking into cloth. He knows without contrivance or thought that this place belongs to him, he to it. No tracks appear in the dusty skim of snow. He probes the frigid air in reverie, as if shaping winter into words. He's composing a poem, I tell myself. No, I correct, he is the poem. The second poem is a little reflection on the times called The Task of Restoring Democracy. Rooting through a box of old clothes, deprived of light and breath for years and sized to fit a previous self, I found an old white handkerchief, threadbare, stained, pitted by moths, though the fading linen is still creased in a symmetry that honors the iron. It's a handkerchief, not a flag, but the cloth remembers its folds. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Joe Servant served as Kentucky Poet Laureate 2003-2004. He is the author of 4 collections of poetry, including Rafting Rise, The Presence of Snow in the Tropics, Anne and Alpheus, 1842-1882, and We Will All Be Changed. He received the Arkansas Poetry Prize, the State Street Press Award, and the Al Smith Individual Artist Fellowship. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, as well as a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship.
When the pandemic began last spring, early in, I had a hard time kind of realizing what it meant. And so after a month or so, I was getting used to my isolation. And I decided, okay, well, I'll use this productively and, spend a lot of time I study reading and writing. But actually, I spent a lot of time sitting in my study looking out into the cold, wet spring woods. I realized that nature was doing its usual thing. And I found that pretty reassuring because, you expect things, when your life comes to a screeching halt, things change radically in society. You expect that somehow it's happening everywhere. And then you look out into your yard and you see that things are not, have not stopped. So this first poem is one I salvaged from that time. Not much I wrote, I think, was worth much. But for want of a better title, I call it Pandemic Poem Number 1, April 2020. Evening. Roosting vultures wearing their scarlet plague masks sit hunched in a gray drizzle. A red fox with his long brush briefly lights up my yard. From the forest floor, turkeys burst upward one by one to balance in the highest branches, their fine feathers lost in the memory-eating rain. Morning, the wet woods shine and fill with clucking hens calling to the gobblers, unfolding their brilliant fans. The vultures launch themselves, rise, and seek again their ancient paths in the heavens. The second poem, last poem, is from my new book, View from the Stork Building. It's not specifically a pandemic poem, but readers have remarked to me that the mood of the book fits the times, and I think that's just simply because the themes of separation and loss and isolation are endemic in classical Chinese poetry. The title is In a Far Country, I Miss You, after Han Shan. Dark willows like smoke, flowers like low clouds. Here, I began to live without you. There, you live without me. We live at opposite ends of the sky. When will we see each other? I mail my words at the bright moon's building. You have freed our pair of swallows. Last night I dreamed of home and saw you weaving there. If your shuttle could feel my sorrow, it would stop its work. If you turned to face me, we would not know each other. We have said goodbye too many times. The coinage of our faces has worn away.
Thank you, Joe. Sina Jeter Naslin served as Kentucky Poet Laureate 2005 to 2006. She is a founding and former director of the Creative Writing MFA at Spalding University. She is the author of several books, including Ahab's Wife, Abundance, and The Fountain at St. James Court. Today she is reading an excerpt from a novel in progress, Before the War.
Hello, it's so good to be here with you and with all of my fellow poet laureates in Kentucky. I'm reading from a novel in progress called Before the War. The war in this case is the Civil War. It has entirely historical characters in it: Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Frederick Douglass, Mary Todd Lincoln, Verena Howell Davis, Anna Murray Douglas. And as I say, it's a book in progress. The excerpt I'm reading just now takes place well before the Civil War. It's during what was called the Chief Black Hawk War, where Abraham Lincoln was the captain of a troop from his area in Illinois. One night, a group of soldiers emerged from the trees, escorting a single Indian, an old man, frightened and not in the least belligerent. "What's going on, boys?" Abe asked in a serious but calm tone. The captive handed Abe a paper. After Abe read the document by the flickering campfire light, he said quietly, "This is a legitimate document of free passage. This Indian man is a friend to white men, and this paper certifies that he is not to be either detained or harmed in any way." Abe spoke casually as though he were relaying simple information, and there was no need for excitement or anger. The Indian man quickly placed the paper back inside the fringed bag that hung over his chest. To Abe's surprise, some men in the group began to raise their muskets. When others unsheathed their knives at the belts, Abe stepped in front of the Indian. "Let's get him," one of the soldiers began to mutter. "Let's get him." "You a coward, man?" someone asked Abe. Now Abe raised his voice, high and pitched, like a steel blade. "If any man thinks I am a coward, let him test it." A quiet fell over the men. Then someone back in the group half sang his taunt. "You so big, you so strong, ain't fair." Another added, "Hand to hand, you got all the advantage from the start." "Choose your weapon then," Abe barked and stood like a tree against them and in front of the Indian, each after each. Abe rested his hands on his hips, elbows out like a barricade or shield before the old Indian. "Choose your weapon. I'll fight you all, one by one." There was silence, and then the knot of men loosened. Some troops left the edge of the group. Then those in front lowered their eyes and walked away. Abe turned to the Indian and gently touched the bag on the man's chest, where the letter now resided. Then Abe opened his hand, gesturing toward the west and nodding his head in a slow yes. The old Indian returned the nod, and like a shadow, he was gone. Like a gliding bat, he disappeared silently into the trees. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sina. Maureen Moorhead served as Kentucky Poet Laureate 2011 through 2012. She is a poet and retired teacher from the Jefferson County Public Schools and Spalding University's MFA program in creative writing. She's published 6 books, including 4 with Kentucky's Larkspur Press. For many years, she has been interested in how literature and health intersect. To that end, she's conducted several workshops with the University of Louisville's healthcare professionals examining how poetry impacts the wellness and understanding of those both giving and receiving care.
The stronghold. We talk about grandchildren as though there is no earthly reason we shouldn't. The sea today provokes us. A school of porpoise follows in the wake of a shrimp boat. A man resembling Dad bicycles the flat, empty beach road. And yet, a storm pushes clouds so inherently dark, we expect to be caught in the downfall. Last night, I saw frightened ghost crabs scatter. No moon, dozens of stars. Each of us carried a flashlight. Ellie, a butterfly net to slap on the sand, scoop, everybody shrieking, the albinos into David's little bucket. Things are not so different now as when a woman we knew staggered into the ocean. Do you remember the Bruegel? If you choose, you can believe Icarus died when he fell all those meters. How many times we have discussed the busy plowman, the distracted shepherd, the son who ignored his father's warning. But might it have ended otherwise? The elegant ship, for example, with an observant captain or a vigilant mother insisting her child attach a beacon. Imagine nothing but sky and sea, clouds swung low upon the water, or a single figure rendered since then, who just may have seen a boy swimming homeward, diving with the pelicans, scanning the beach early next morning for tire tracks, evidence of something important, something miraculous, the happy night work of loggerheads. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Frank X. Walker served as Kentucky Poet Laureate 2013 through 2014. A founding member of the Appalachian Poets, he is the author of several books of poetry, including Masked Man Black, Last Will, Last Testament, and Ink and Stains and Watermarks. He's a recipient of the Thomas D. Clark Literary Award for Excellence, the Actors Theater's Keeper of the Chronicle Award, the Al Smith Individual Artist Fellowship, and a Lannan Literary Fellowship in Poetry.
Here are 3 short poems for the important women in my life in honor of our new laureate, who is a sister to me. Ink Stains and Watermarks for Faith A. Smith. The color of ink squeezed from walnut hulls. She was born too dark to be rocked to sleep at night. Her spine was not really too firm to be cradled and caressed. She was perfectly legible. Her mother just found her too hard to read. The car her father was driving did not crash. She did not fly through the windshield before children could be perfect bound. That was not a scar across her forehead. It was a publisher's colophon. It was an exclamation point dotted by her nose. It was the beginning of the sign of the cross. No ex-husbands, just a coffee stain and a slightly visible tear where 2 pages formerly yoked had been ripped apart. No miscarriage, just a chapter she wrote in haste that her editor rejected. She did not have a stroke while she carried me. She was just teaching me how to be still, to focus on each little sound, to grow up crazy in love with words. She marked me, and now every time I open a book, I see her smiling face. Another thing I like about you, Frashana. You point and instruct, but not like in your classrooms full of eager young scholars who sit anxious and hungry for the knowledge you plow them up with, but like a mother giraffe, demonstrating how to choose the best leaves, how to tiptoe lips and tongue around thorns. You lean back and smile like he is yours too, wrapping him in a warmth extended only to the lucky few who have fed at your breast. You wade into his thick boy crust, full indifference, suppressed enthusiasm, muted affection, and wait patiently until a smile escapes, until his arms and eyes are wide open, announcing the soft, bubbly middle he is learning to hide, to disguise under cocked baseball caps. In 2 years, he could be Emmett Till. Today, in this fantasy, he is just our son. Iron Water Women for my 6, sometimes 7 sisters. I learned something new and different about my sisters almost every day. To replace the half-truths I imagined, to make sense of how strange they were. Thin doors and the sound of tiny waterfalls suggested that they peed squatting or sitting. Their new muscles bubbled to the surface overnight in pairs of little pointed mounds. All the sweet tea and Pepsi Cola they drank crashed like waves in their hips and back pockets. At times their aches and pains rolled in like the tide, were as big as the moon gets full, and just as often. When I first noticed my frequently disappearing white tube socks, I falsely concluded that whenever the bread and milk ran out, their feet bled like a dozen country eggs plucked a little too late, or my nose on the hottest summer nights. I grew up believing they leaked iron from their own private wells. I figured mama was an ocean because my sisters were rivers who taught me the meaning of damn. Thank you. Congratulations, Crystal.
Thank you, Frank. George Ella Lyon served as Kentucky Poet Laureate 2015 through 2016. Originally from Harlan County, George Ella Lyon writes in multiple genres for readers of all ages. Her recent collections include Many Storied House and Voices of Justice, poems about people working for a better world. Back to the Light poems will be out from the University Press of Kentucky in early April.
I'm going to read 3 short poems from the pandemic. One from my desk, one from a neighborhood walk, and one from a tricky moment in quarantine. And over here, my little cat is licking the Supreme Court. Okay, it's a photo. on the wall beside my desk. He has licked 3 holes in the sky and 1 in the pediment. He doesn't lick the protesters marching in front of it, one of whom is probably me. Well, she was me back in '07 during the Bush-Cheney debacle. Things looked bleak back then. Enormous imperialistic blunders coming from another white building across the way. Someday someone will line out for those of us who come after how we got from there to 2020. Assuming enough folks survive the virus and live in a world with the luxury of history. Assuming health, food, jobs, water. Assuming we learn what we've been sent to our rooms to learn. There is no them and us, just us. Just us and the living earth. What is it? It's the heat. It's the storm. It's the temperature plummeting. It's the virus, and what should we do? It's the last grape tomatoes turned furry and effervescent. It's the to-do list written and the to-don't list hovering. It's working to hold on to good news till bad news gets out of town. It's the calendar where you can't write, have a vision. It's our neighbor sitting in a sling chair, in her yard, in the gloaming, smoking, listening to a crackling recorded voice we can't understand. What is it, I ask, as we come closer and see that she has a flashlight beam trained on an open book in her lap. Revelation, she says. I'm taking a course in it. This last one is a haiku. My husband teaches me how to cut up apples. Ah, all those wrong pies.
Thank you, Georgella. Frederick Smock served as Kentucky Poet Laureate 2017 through 2018. He's a professor of English at Bellarmine University in Louisville, the author of a dozen books of poetry and essays. His most recent is a translation from the Russian poet Regina Derevia, Images in Black, Continuous.
I have a few short poems. The first one about the old Asian poet Li Po, who loved his wine. This poem is simply titled To Li Po. Here's to Li Po, drinking wine on the riverbank under willows, cheering the paper boats floating along toward the capital. And look, there is now a new constellation in the night sky. Li Po, drinking wine, lifting a goblet of stars to his dark, dark lips. A poem, Canopy, about trees, among other things. A redbird flickers past the open window. A moment later, her clipped chirp reports from the canopy where she makes her home. What does she say? And with what urgency? What does she say? Another poem about trees. I grew up in the country and loved trees from childhood on. Trees. In a landscape with trees, the last thing we see is the trees. We look through them for a destination, but the destination is the trees, like that one there, with its arms upraised to greet us. And I'll finish with 2 nocturnes, one for summer, one for winter. Nocturne, summer. Night comes, the bridge has been crossed. Curtains in the window breathe in, breathe out, and somehow the lowing of the far Butchertown train reaches my open window, even now, these many years later. and to conclude, Nocturne for Winter. The year will end tonight, as on every night, with always the same sign, the moon-like clock on the town hall rising slowly through the late hours, the bare trees. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. And to conclude our series of readings, our newly inducted Kentucky Poet Laureate 2021 through 2022, Crystal Wilkinson.
This is a flash piece that was published in the Kenyon Review earlier this year. A meditation on grief, things we carry, things we remember. I remember this place where burdens wash away in the dark and mothers' dresses float like blossoms. A boy drowns, his head turned toward home, body facing the farmer's house where the girl who loves him sleeps. She is the farmer's daughter. They say she is the one who hit his head, the one who hoisted the rock, the one who watched his blood ooze out. This is the way you wash your clothes in the creek. This is the way you catch catfish in deep water. The mothers stand in water to their knees, their dresses wafting out like sheets on a line. On the creek bank, a child runs circles, catching the wind, and the mother's dresses float like blossoms. The mothers sing prayers for the boy's mother who looks out her kitchen window and cries. The circle of mothers in the water whisper a prayer for the girl who tells all who will listen that she loved the boy who died. Her mother stands in the backyard, her hand on the chopping hoe with tears streaming down her face. The fathers brood in the fields, walking slow as lepers, hearts and houses filled with grief. I almost drowned once. My grandmother's dress blossomed around her like a sail. She was my John boat in the creek. My mother stood on the shore, frozen with fear, my father's name mute on her tongue, his kiss spoiled fruit in her sweet young mouth. The dead boy's ghost haunts this place, dark water flowing like a deacon's robe. On nights spoiled with teenage trouble, I went to the creek and waited for the boy, hoping he would listen. Do you dream of the farmer's daughter? I asked. Are you sorry for what you've done? He didn't answer. They say he raped the girl, but I wasn't afraid of him. By then, I had been raped too and was becoming a dangerous woman. I waited for him and held court with the moon. I'm here, I said. Let's get this thing done. In this place where burdens wash away, I stood, my dress flowering, floating. I was drowning too. My face turned toward home, my black body facing my father's house where my mother cried for me. They say the boy was handsome, but I never saw him in the flesh. At night, the creek did scare me. Its rush like a boy's whispered threat in a girl's ear. But here, the mothers are always standing with water to their knees, their dresses billowing out like sheets on a line, praying because there was always something roaring in those trees, teeth gnashing, fathers killing boys for the sake of their daughters, eyes always watching, eyes always glistening in the dark.
Thank you, Crystal. And again, our congratulations on being selected as Kentucky Poet Laureate. And thanks for those of you who are joining us virtually from the comfort of your living rooms, patios, or front porches. For the past few weeks, Kentucky writers have been sharing their original writings as part of our Writers' Day video project on our Facebook page. Make sure you check out their readings. You're likely to find your next favorite Kentucky author or poet among them. And Writers' Day continues this evening beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern, courtesy of Paul Sawyer Public Library in Frankfort. The library will host a virtual Kentucky Poet Laureate reading featuring Crystal Wilkinson and many of the former poets laureate you've heard from today. The event is free to the general public and will live stream on the library's Facebook page. No registration is required. Before we close, I'd like to thank the Kentucky Arts Council staff and the Tourism Arts and Heritage Cabinet Communications team for producing this video. We are fortunate to have access to a wealth of talent that helps us bring this virtual programming to you. Thank you again and enjoy your Kentucky Writers' Day.